Well, Putin made very clear from the very beginning what he wants are three things. First, he wanted Ukraine to be non-aligned. In other words, neutral, similar to Austria or Sweden, not part of the NATO alliance, because he said, we will not tolerate NATO forces, specifically U.S. forces and U.S. missiles, similar to the Pershing II that we had back in the 1980s, within essentially minutes of Moscow. We're not going to do that. That's unacceptable to us. That was what Burns was trying to tell people in his memo. So that's the first thing. Second, that the breakaway republics, which are fundamentally Russian, and in general, Russians living in eastern Ukraine, because the ones in the Donetsk and Luhansk are not the only Russians, they should not be subjected to Ukrainianization. They should not be forced to speak Ukrainian, write Ukrainian, and so forth. In other words, become what they're not, Ukrainians. There really are differences, by the way, that people in the West don't seem to appreciate. And he said, that's wrong. All we're asking is that you give them autonomy and you allow them to speak their own language and live as they would. I mean, for instance, in Austria, there is a community of Slovenes living on Austrian soil. Nobody ever talks about it. They write in Slovenian. They speak Slovenian. They're part of Austria. They're loyal citizens, but they're Slovenes, and nobody has any objections to that, and things are fine. Well, that was the point that Putin was trying to make. And then finally, once you get through those two things, I think then the most important thing for Putin was, whatever comes out of this will not be a threat to Russia. Very simple. That's really what we want more than anything else.
How does Putin justify attacking civilian targets, particularly residential neighborhoods and hospitals?
Russians are not attacking civilian targets. What happens, it happened very recently, they will send some Russian troops into an area, particularly in what we call an urban area, a build-up area where there are apartments or homes. And if the Russians are fired upon and they identify where the fire came from, that then becomes a legitimate target. That's no different from what any army has ever done. If you're trying to avoid inflicting civilian casualties, and the Russians went in there with specifically that goal in mind, they didn't want to destroy property. They didn't want to kill large numbers of people. They said, we're not going to fire on anything that is civilian unless we take fire and we can identify the source. Well, once you've taken fire, you can identify the source. That's a legitimate target. We've done that in Iraq. We've done it in Afghanistan. And sometimes large numbers of civilians are killed, which is unfortunate. It's called war. We've all been there. We know what that means.
We have. What would you advise the American government to do if Joe Biden called you up and asked for your advice?
Well, the good news is that the probability of that happening is about zero. I think he's going to listen to Tony Blinken and Victoria Nuland, who are obviously in charge of policy as far as Ukraine is concerned. And his policy is to make Ukraine suffer as long as possible on the assumption that this hurts Russia and that Russia can be bled white and that ultimately Putin can be made so unpopular that everyone wants to remove him. There's no evidence for that, by the way. I mean, we've had all of these unsubstantiated reports that are all traced back to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense telling us that the Russians are losing, Russian troops are deserting, Russians are being killed in large numbers. Everyone wants out. The Russian army is demoralized, and so forth and so on. There's no evidence for that. I haven't been able to find it.
Does Zelensky get killed like Salvatore Allende with a machine gun in his hand at the last minute?
No, I don't think so. In fact, I think the Russians, who have always known where he was from the very first moment, have very carefully avoided doing any damage whatsoever to him personally. I think the Russians would like someone that they can negotiate with, and they're negotiating with him and this small team that he sends to the negotiations in Belarus in the hopes that they could end this with the least trouble as possible. Thus far, it hasn't worked, and I think it hasn't worked not because Zelensky's not willing to sign up, because he's given indications that he would. It's because we won't allow it to stop. So the real question is, when are we going to allow this killing to end? When are we going to allow some sort of treaty to emerge, or at least a ceasefire that results in a treaty? And that depends on the extent to which we ultimately find out that we failed in our attempt to bleed Ukraine, bleed the Russians, and remove Putin.